Hey, what's up everybody? This is Osterberg501 and today I want to go over some new news we have gotten for Lost Ark in the past day, and that is they will be nerfing some specific tier 1 and tier 2 guardian raids and abyssal dungeons. And I'll have the lists of everything getting nerfed on screen so you can see which of these specific guardian raids and abyssal dungeons are getting nerfed. Now just to start off, I don't think they should be nerfing this content, and I don't think the actual difficulty of these fights are the main issue. And that's another reason why I think just nerfing the difficulty isn't going to necessarily fix the problems with some of these fights. Now, just to preface this as well, I have beaten every single one of these guardian raids and abyssal dungeons that are being nerfed, and I have beaten them all with just random groups. So randomly queuing into these, I have beaten all of these, and I've beaten every tier 1 and tier 2 guardian raid and abyssal dungeon, also just randomly queuing, so with random pug groups. And just to start off, the abyssal dungeon nerfs make the least amount of sense to me, even though some of the ones they're nerfing are pretty difficult, especially with pugs. I think these abyssal dungeons are generally a lot more enjoyable, and I think groups usually end up having less difficulty with these, and I think people don't get burnt out of these near as quickly because they are weekly content instead of daily like the guardian raids. And I really don't think any of these should really be getting nerfed, especially the ones that are nerfing. There's only like 1 or 2 bosses in the ones that are nerfing that I think are a big jump up from the difficulty of all the other abyssal dungeons. So the abyssal dungeon stuff I don't think really needs nerf at all, to be honest. Now my main argument is with the guardian raids. Now like I mentioned, I don't think they should be nerfing any of these at all, but I do understand some of the frustrations of players when it comes to some of these guardian raid fights, because I have read some of the forum posts that were asking for these fights to be nerfed. And I think there's a few different things that all contribute to people wanting these nerfed. And one of the first and main things being some of these fights just legitimately aren't fun. Say going to Virtus, that fight is one of the least fun boss fights I have done in any MMO I have ever played. Now keep in mind, I don't think I have wiped on this boss queuing for it in a single group yet. It's not necessarily super difficult, but this fight I hate doing. I don't find anything about the Virtus fight fun at all. Every single part of it is not enjoyable for me, even though I've completed it on like 3 or 4 characters by now, and I don't think I've wiped on it. And I think the mix of these fights still being somewhat difficult, especially with pugs, them not necessarily being enjoyable boss fights, and them being daily content per character. I think that is the mix of things that causes some players to want these to be nerfed, because they just want to go in and do this content, get over with it for the day, and then move on to something else that they may enjoy more. Now there are definitely still some players that just want them nerfed because they think they're too hard, and again, I don't agree with that. I don't think these should be nerfed, but I do think some of the people publicly complaining about the difficulty of these fights aren't just complaining about the difficulty. And also something to add on top of that is that in my experience, like I mentioned, I have randomly queued and completed all the tier 1 and tier 2 abyssal dungeons and guardian raids. In my experience, especially for guardian raids, it usually doesn't come down to people not doing mechanics correct. There are groups I'll join into that will just wipe on some of the bosses because people can't dodge or do a wipe mechanic correctly, but most of the time the bigger issue is the actual output of the group. My main character is a support paladin, and in a lot of the longer lasting guardian raid groups I'm in, it usually ends up being that I'm doing over 30% of the group's damage as a support, while also being a full support build and giving the group a ton of healing, a ton of shielding, and other support buffs. And I think I've definitely noticed that a lot of the groups I'm in, if the fight's going for say 5 to 10 minutes, people are usually doing much better, dodging a lot more stuff, doing mechanics correctly, being more optimal. But once you get into the groups that are like 15-minute fights or longer, that's usually when people just start to die off later on into the fight. And this leads me to believe that output and character builds are kind of a big issue in tier 1 and tier 2 right now. I think a lot of people don't understand that engravings are probably the most important part of their build, and eye level isn't everything. Engravings are actually more important than your item level. If you can get into the fight, that's all the item level you need. And I've definitely seen this when inspecting some people. Some people have like 1 general engraving, no class engraving, and that's it. Or some people only have rank 1 of their class engraving, and that's the only engraving they have, and it's only on level 1, and we are in tier 2 doing like a mid-level guardian raid or something like that. So I think that is also an issue that's compounding the difficulty idea of these fights, that some people just aren't building their characters correctly and don't have the output to match the content they're currently in. And I do think some of the reason for that is because we got so much gearing and content with having 3 tiers at the start that people aren't able to learn content as it was originally intended to be played through. And since we're gearing up so quickly, doing so many boss fights so quickly, that I think it's almost a information overload for some people as well. Now, I do think there's a silver lining to these nerfs, and that being that they're only nerfing specific tier 1 and tier 2 guardian raids and abyssal dungeons. They have currently not nerfed anything in tier 3, and I hope it stays that way. If these end up being the only nerfs and they don't touch tier 3, they don't touch legion raids, I don't think this is going to end up being a big issue at all. But a big worry for me, a big worry for a lot of other experienced players and players of the Russian or Korean regions, is that they will end up nerfing legion raids. And that's pretty much what everybody that knows about the legion raids don't want them to do. The legion raids are going to be the main endgame content, the main big raids once you get into the endgame and once they're released for us. And I hope those stay the same difficulty, because that is content that is supposed to be very difficult. It's supposed to be the magnum opus of the game. And if they keep the nerfs just to tier 1 and tier 2, I don't think it's going to be a big deal. Tier 1 and tier 2 in the Western version isn't the actual endgame because we have up to tier 3. So you can almost see it as tier 1 and tier 2 is supposed to be like the learning for all the players, that they're being taught throughout all these boss fights, all the mechanics of the game, all the gearing of the game. So if they're looking at it that way and they're not going to touch tier 3 and they're not going to nerf anything in tier 3, it does also make a little bit more sense. The tier 1 and tier 2 could have stuff that's going to be nerfed a little bit just because that's not seen as the actual end game. But that's pretty much all I want to go over for these Lost Ark nerfs. So subscribe if you want to see more Lost Ark or other MMO videos. Leave a like if you liked the video. Leave a comment down below what you guys think about these boss nerfs, and thanks for watching.